I'm not the next Michael Jordan. I'm the first LeBron James. That line was not delivered in a moment of arrogance. It was delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided, at a very young age, that the framework they were building was their own. It was the statement of a person who understood the difference between imitation and construction, between following a path and clearing one. LeBron James said those words early in his career, when every camera in America was waiting for him to fail, or at the very least, to stumble under the weight of the comparisons being placed on his shoulders before he had played a single minute of professional basketball. He did not stumble. He did not fail. And now, more than 2 decades later, the line reads less like a Declaration of Independence and more like a blueprint announcement. He was telling you what he was going to build. He was just telling you before you were ready to believe him. There is a question worth sitting with before we go any further into the story of LeBron James. It is not the question most people ask about him. Most people ask about championships. Most people ask about the comparison to Jordan. Most people debate the ranking, the rings, the statistics, the era. Those are interesting questions in their own right, but they are not the most interesting question. The most interesting question is this: how does a human being sustain elite performance not just for a season or two, not just for a decade, but across more than 20 years of professional basketball against younger and younger opponents in a league that is constantly evolving while simultaneously managing the weight of being one of the most scrutinized public figures on the planet? How does someone maintain that? What does the inside of that look like? What are the systems, the habits, the mental architectures that make that kind of career possible? That is what we are here to study. LeBron James is not interesting simply because he is talented. Talent by itself explains almost nothing about sustained greatness. The history of professional sports is littered with talented people who faded, who peaked early, who collapsed under pressure, who could not translate physical gifts into long careers. Talent is the starting material. What you do with it, the architecture you build around it, the disciplines you impose, the thinking patterns you develop, the relationships you form and the ones you cut loose, the sacrifices you make that no one sees, those are the things that explain careers like his. And his career, by any serious measurement, is one of the most remarkable in the history of American professional sport. He entered the NBA at 18 years old. 18. The league at that time was populated by grown men, many of them in their prime, who had been building their bodies and their games for years before he arrived. He did not just survive that environment. He dominated it within a very short period. By 22, he was in the NBA Finals. By 23, he was carrying a team of journeymen and role players further than anyone had a right to expect. And that was just the beginning. And what followed was not a straight line to the top. It was something far more interesting. It was a series of crises, reinventions, controversies, and recoveries that would have ended most careers. Instead, each one seemed to make him sharper. Each crisis seemed to produce a more refined version of the same person. That is not an accident. That is a system at work. To understand LeBron James, you have to go back before basketball. Not far before. He did not have the luxury of a long, sheltered childhood in which to develop at his own pace. He grew up in Akron, Ohio, in circumstances that most people who write about him acknowledge, but few truly reckon with. His mother, Gloria James, was 16 years old when he was born. His father was not present. The two of them moved repeatedly during his early years, sometimes staying with relatives, sometimes not having a stable address at all. There's a period in his childhood during which he missed more than 80 days of school in a single academic year because the instability of his living situation made consistent attendance impossible. That number is worth pausing on. 80 days in a single year for a child. What does that kind of early life do to a person? It can do many things. It can produce paralysis, a sense that the world is fundamentally unreliable and that there is no point trying to build anything because it will be taken away. It can produce recklessness, a kind of why should I care nihilism. Or it can produce something else entirely. It can produce a fierce, almost desperate attachment to control, a need to build systems that work, a drive to create stability where none existed before. In LeBron James, it produced the third thing. You can trace almost every one of his later behavioral patterns directly back to this early formation. The obsessive control over his body, the meticulous financial planning, the loyalty to his Akron friends, kept close for decades, the deep suspicion of institutions that he did not build himself. All of it traces back to a childhood in which nothing was guaranteed and everything had to be earned or constructed from scratch. When he was 9 years old, a man named Frank Walker noticed him. Walker was a local youth football coach, and he saw something in the boy and offered him stability. And LeBron moved in with the Walker family for a period, and during that time, his attendance at school became regular again. He started playing organized basketball. He found a structure, and the structure, for a mind like his, was not a cage. It was a launch pad. He did not chafe against it. He embraced it, and then exceeded it. Within a very short time, the people around him understood that what they were dealing with was not just a talented kid. It was a kid who seemed to absorb systems and then immediately begin improving them. A kid who watched everything and forgot nothing. The competitive drive appeared almost from the start, not the kind of aggression that gets children in trouble, not the snarling, self-destructive kind of competitiveness that can sabotage talent. It was something more measured than that, and more dangerous. It was the competitiveness of someone who is keeping score internally at all times, who tracks everything, who notices every slight, every doubt, every whispered suggestion that he might not be good enough, and files it away, not in a place of bitterness, but in a place of fuel. His childhood teammates and coaches describe a child who was almost eerily focused, who did not need to be told to practice, who would stay long after others had left, who approached the game with an intentionality that felt, in a child, slightly out of place, as if he were already operating with an adult's understanding of what the work required. There is a story from his early teenage years that gets told occasionally. He was playing in a game against older kids, high schoolers, kids with more experience and more physical development. And he was not just competitive against them, he was studying them. Mid-game, while playing, he was processing what they were doing, where the gaps were, what adjustments were needed. He made those adjustments in real time, not just athletically, but tactically. His coaches at the time began to realize that they were not just dealing with an athlete. They were dealing with a student of the game who happened to also have unusual physical gifts. That combination is not as common as people assume. There are many physically gifted athletes who never develop the analytical component. And there are many sharp, analytical minds who cannot translate thought into athletic execution. The rare thing, the genuinely rare thing, is both at once. In LeBron James, at 14 years old, both were already present. The first principle worth naming in the architecture of LeBron James is this: he treats his body as infrastructure, not as equipment. This distinction is subtle, but it is everything. Equipment is something you use until it breaks and then you replace it. Infrastructure is something you invest in continuously because you understand that everything else depends on it. From the very beginning of his professional career, and accelerating dramatically as that career progressed, LeBron James treated physical maintenance not as a necessity, but as a strategic priority. He did not just work out. He built a comprehensive system around his physical longevity that came to include sleep protocols, nutritional planning, cryotherapy, hyperbaric chamber sessions, and a reported annual investment in his body that reached and eventually surpassed $1 million per year. $1 million per year on recovery, maintenance, and optimization. Most professional athletes treat the off-season as a period of rest. LeBron James treats the off-season as a second season, one dedicated entirely to the work of making the next competitive season possible. The distinction between those two approaches compounds over time in ways that are dramatic. An athlete who rests accumulates the small degradations that come with age without counteracting them. An athlete who invests in maintenance and recovery can delay, sometimes dramatically, the timeline of physical decline. This is not merely a theory. The evidence is in the career. He was playing 45 minutes per playoff game in his late 30s. He was leading the league in scoring in his 37th season. He became the all-time leading scorer in NBA history at an age when most players from previous generations had already retired. The body as infrastructure. Everything else follows from that. But the physical investment alone does not explain the longevity. It is a necessary condition, not a sufficient one, because alongside the physical investment, there is something else happening. There is a continuous, deliberate investment in the mind, in the way the game is understood, in the way information is processed, in the way adjustments are made in real time. The second principle worth studying is his relationship to film and preparation. LeBron James is not famous as a student of film in the way that some other players have been. Kobe Bryant, for example, was famous for film obsession, and that reputation was widely publicized. LeBron's version of the same habit is perhaps less mythologized, but it is no less real, and in some ways it is more sophisticated. Because what LeBron is doing when he watches film is not merely memorizing plays or cataloging opponents' tendencies. He is building mental models of entire systems. He is trying to understand the logic of how opposing teams think, not just what they do. His former coaches and teammates describe a player who arrives at film sessions having already done independent analysis. He is not waiting to be taught. He is arriving with hypotheses and testing them against what the group sees together. He asks questions that demonstrate a systems-level understanding of the game rather than a surface-level one. Why does this team run this play in this situation? What are they trying to force? What do they think we will do? And therefore, if we do something different, what becomes available? These are not just basketball questions. They are questions about information asymmetry, about the exploitation of expectation, about the moment when the thing your opponent has prepared for becomes a trap because you have already seen it coming. His basketball intelligence operates at the level of strategy, not just tactics. He is not just thinking about what to do next. He is thinking about the shape of the entire encounter. There is a moment from the 2016 NBA Finals that illustrates this better than almost any other. Cleveland was down 3-1 against the Golden State Warriors, the team that had just won 73 regular season games, the most in NBA history to that point. The statistical probability of a team coming back from a 3-1 deficit in the finals was essentially zero. No team had ever done it. And in Game 5, early in the fourth quarter, with the series still very much in doubt, LeBron James made a play that is still discussed not just as a great athletic moment, but as evidence of a specific kind of intelligence. He chased down Andre Iguodala on a fast break, a player known for his athleticism and finishing ability, and blocked his shot from behind at the rim in a moment that seemed to defy both physics and competitive logic. It was not just the physical execution of the play that mattered. It was what the play communicated. It communicated that he had done the film work. He knew Iguodala's tendencies at the rim. He knew the angles. He had modeled this scenario in advance in some prior session of preparation, so that when the moment arrived, he was not reacting. He was executing something he had already rehearsed in his mind. The play did not happen by accident. It happened because someone had already imagined it. Cleveland won that game. They won Game 6. They won Game 7. They completed the greatest comeback in NBA Finals history. And the cornerstone of that comeback was not just athleticism, it was preparation that made athleticism effective at exactly the right moment. The third principle is one that is harder to name but equally important. It might be called positional fluidity as a philosophical commitment. From very early in his career, LeBron James refused to be categorized. He was listed as a small forward, but he could and did play every position on the floor with genuine competence. He ran the point guard in crucial moments. He guarded the opposing team's best player regardless of position. He played center in small ball lineups. He orchestrated the offense from the top of the key one possession and then posted up a smaller defender in the next. This was not merely versatility as a skill, it was versatility as a philosophical commitment to being uncategorizable and therefore unguardable. He understood early that the moment an opponent could put you in a box, they could plan for you. The moment you become categorically legible to a defense, you become more manageable. And manageable was the one thing he refused to be. This philosophy extended beyond the technical execution of basketball. It extended to how he thought about his position in the broader culture of the sport. He refused, from very early, to be the kind of player who simply played basketball and deferred to coaches and management on all other questions. He studied contracts. He studied salary cap mechanics. He studied roster construction. He became, over time, one of the most sophisticated thinkers about team building in the league, not just as a player, but as a quasi-architectural force in the construction of competitive rosters. He formed a production company. He built a media business. He opened a school in Akron. He developed relationships with business figures and political figures that extended far beyond what most athletes considered within their domain. Positional fluidity was not just how he played basketball. It was how he understood his own life. He refused every box that was offered to him and built his own instead. The fourth principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive, given the public narrative around him. It might be called the willingness to be wrong in service of being right. LeBron James has made decisions during his career that were spectacularly, publicly wrong. The decision, in 2010, the televised announcement that he was leaving Cleveland to join Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh in Miami, was by nearly any measure a communications disaster. It alienated fans, generated an enormous backlash, led to the burning of his jersey in the streets of Cleveland, and produced one of the most visceral moments of public hatred directed at an athlete in modern American sports history. Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, published an open letter that was openly hostile and mocking. LeBron James went from being the beloved prodigal son of Ohio to, for a significant portion of the American sports public, a figure of contempt and betrayal. And then, in Miami, in his first finals appearance with the Heat, he played poorly. Uncharacteristically, mysteriously, almost inexplicably poorly. Cleveland fans felt vindicated. Critics doubled down. Here's what is interesting about that sequence of events. Most people process public humiliation by either doubling down in defensiveness or collapsing in retreat. LeBron James did neither. He absorbed the information, he sat with it, he acknowledged, in a way that few athletes his age would have been willing to, that some of the criticism was fair. Not all of it, and not the cruelest and most personal elements of it, but some of it. He acknowledged that the way the announcement was handled was wrong. He acknowledged that his performance in the 2011 finals was not good enough. And then, rather than becoming smaller under the weight of that acknowledgement, he became larger. He used the clarity that comes from genuine self-assessment to rebuild. The following season in Miami, he was one of the best players in the history of the league. He won the championship. He was named Finals MVP. He dismantled every narrative of decline before it could fully form. What happened in that process is a pattern that recurs repeatedly across his career. He is not someone who operates under the illusion of perfect judgment. He makes large, risky decisions, some of which do not work out as planned. And when they do not, he does not manufacture reasons why they were right all along. He recalibrates. He absorbs the information that the failure contains. He updates his model. This is far more rare than it sounds. The ego investment that most elite athletes have in their decisions makes genuine recalibration enormously difficult. To admit that a decision was wrong, when that admission will be broadcast to millions of people who are already skeptical of you, requires a specific kind of psychological architecture. It requires the ability to separate your ego from your judgment. To understand that being wrong about a decision does not make you a wrong person. It just means the model needs updating. LeBron James has that architecture. It has served him many times. The fifth principle is one that coaches and analysts who have watched him closely tend to describe in similar terms. It is an almost obsessive attention to the morale and function of the collective, even while pursuing individual excellence. LeBron James is, statistically, one of the greatest individual players in the history of basketball. And yet, his orientation is fundamentally collective. He thinks in terms of systems and teams and relationships. He is one of the all-time great passers, not just technically, but philosophically. He genuinely wants his teammates to succeed. Not as a performance of unselfishness, not as a tactic to make himself look good, but as a deep expression of how he understands competition. He believes, and this belief has been consistent across every team he has played for, that the best chance of winning lies in the maximization of every available resource. Every teammate, no matter how limited, is a resource to be understood and deployed. Every role player has a best version of himself that, if accessed, makes the collective stronger. This creates something interesting in the teams he plays for. His teammates tend to become better when they play with him. Not marginally better, significantly better. Players who are considered journeymen, role players, minor figures in the league, routinely have career best seasons when placed in his orbit. This is partly tactical, because he creates so many opportunities for others. But it is also something less tangible. It is the effect of playing alongside someone who genuinely sees you, who is paying attention to what you can do and actively creating situations in which you can do it. Most elite athletes see the game through their own lens first. LeBron James seems to genuinely see the game through the collective lens first, and then determine where he himself fits best within that collective. This is not selflessness. It is a more sophisticated understanding of how to win. There's a story from his early years in Cleveland that the people who were in the locker room at the time still talk about. He was 20 years old, already the best player on the team and arguably one of the better players in the league. A veteran on the team, someone who had been around the league for years, was struggling with his shot, going through a difficult stretch. In practice, one day, LeBron spent an extended period after the formal session working with this veteran. Not because someone asked him to, not because there was any particular strategic reason, but because he had noticed the problem and believed that solving it would help the team. He has done versions of this throughout his career. He pays attention to the specific struggles of specific teammates and then invests voluntarily in addressing them. The collective is not an abstraction for him. It is a set of specific individuals whose specific problems he takes seriously. The sixth principle might be the one that is most often misunderstood, and therefore most worth dwelling on carefully. It is what could be called legacy consciousness as a navigational tool. LeBron James has been thinking about his legacy since before most people would consider it appropriate. He has been asked about it in interviews since his early 20s, and his answers have been, from very early on, remarkably sophisticated. He does not discuss legacy the way an insecure person discusses it, as external validation to be accumulated. He discusses it the way an architect discusses a building they are in the process of constructing, as a thing being built according to a plan, through daily decisions, each of which either advances the design or compromises it. This means that he has spent his career making decisions that a person purely focused on short-term success would not make. He returned to Cleveland in 2014 partly because he understood that winning a championship for his hometown, for Akron, for the people who had followed him from the beginning, was a piece of the story he was building that could not be substituted with another championship somewhere else. When Cleveland won in 2016, he wept. And what he said in his acceptance speech about bringing a championship to Northeast Ohio, about fulfilling the promise he had made when he came home, was not a performance of emotion. It was the recognition of a narrative beat that he had been consciously building toward for years. He understood that the meaning of winning is partly determined by context, by what you were trying to do when you won it. And so he managed his context carefully, making choices that shaped the story being told, rather than simply accumulating outcomes. This approach to legacy is not without its complications. It can produce choices that seem strange from the outside, because the logic of those choices is not always publicly legible. Why does he talk about wanting to be a billionaire? Why does he discuss the business empire in the same breath as the basketball career? Because to him they are not separate. They are chapters in the same story. He watched what happened to athletes who were great, but who finished their careers with nothing or close to nothing, who had been used by institutions and discarded, who had generated enormous wealth for owners and leagues and television networks while their own financial security remained precarious. He decided early that this would not be his story, and the decision was not made from greed. It was made from the same instinct for control and self-determination that runs through everything he does. He would not be a resource extracted by others. He would build his own systems, and those systems would outlast his playing career. The seventh principle is one that becomes visible only when you look at the arc of his career rather than any individual moment. It is the capacity for reinvention without loss of identity. This is genuinely difficult to do. Most athletes who attempt to reinvent their game as they age lose something essential in the process. They become a lesser version of their earlier self, or they become a different player entirely, which can feel like a kind of loss. LeBron James has reinvented himself multiple times and emerged each time as something that is clearly continuous with what came before, while also being more adapted to his current physical reality. In his early years, he was primarily an athlete in the most physical sense, a force of nature whose advantage was as much about what his body could do as about what his mind could see. By his mid-career, the balance was shifting. The body was still extraordinary, but the mind had become the primary advantage. He was slower in absolute terms by the standards of his position, but he was more efficient. He was making better decisions about when to attack and when to defer. He was conserving energy in ways that his younger self had not needed to. He was, in the language of basketball analysis, adding points of wisdom to every inch he lost in explosion. And because he had built the physical infrastructure so carefully, the body continued to deliver on the demands the mind was making of it far longer than anyone had a right to expect. By his late 30s, the reinvention was essentially complete. He was a completely different player, technically, than the one who had entered the league, and yet the core principles were unchanged. The commitment to understanding the game rather than merely playing it, the refusal to be categorized, the investment in the collective, the preparation, the film study, the physical maintenance, all of it was still there, running beneath a different surface manifestation. He had changed the vehicle without changing the driver, and the driver, across all of those years, had only gotten smarter. The eighth principle is one that requires a word that is often misused in discussions of elite competition. It is resilience, but resilience understood not as the ability to absorb punishment and keep going, which is a relatively crude version of the concept, but as the ability to encounter failure or adversity and extract information from it that makes the next attempt more intelligent. The crude version of resilience is about endurance. The sophisticated version is about learning. LeBron James operates according to the sophisticated version. The moments of failure in his career are numerous and well documented. The 2007 finals, when his first Cleveland team was swept by the San Antonio Spurs, and he played poorly. The 2010 and 2011 seasons, culminating in the Miami debacle in the finals. The 2014 finals, which his new Miami team lost to San Antonio. Each of these was a genuine failure, not a near miss, not a noble defeat, a clear, documented failure against a better team or a better version of a team. And what happened after each one is what matters. Not just the emotional recovery, not just the returning to the court, but the specific, identifiable changes that the failure produced. After 2007, he understood that he could not carry a team to a championship through individual heroism alone. The lesson was about roster construction. He spent the next 3 years understanding, at a level he had not before, what the supporting cast requirements were for a championship run. After 2011, he understood that there was a specific mental component of his performance under pressure that needed attention. He could not point to a physical reason for his struggles in that series. The reason was mental, something about the way he processed the stakes of that particular moment that interfered with his execution. He went to work on that. He found people who helped him understand the psychology of performance under peak pressure, and he came back the following year and was arguably better under pressure than he had ever been. After 2014, the lesson was about chemistry and timing, and the specific difficulties of building a dynasty on the foundation of 3 all-stars rather than 1. Each failure contained specific information. He extracted it, he applied it, he moved forward with more knowledge than he had before. This is not ordinary. This is a specific, practiced skill. The ninth principle is about the management of narrative, and it is perhaps the most unusual one to discuss in the context of athletic greatness. But it is impossible to understand LeBron James without it. He has been, from very early in his career, unusually conscious of the stories being told about him and unusually skilled at intervening in those stories. Not by controlling the press in a crude or bullying way, but by understanding that narrative shapes perception and perception shapes reality, particularly in a sport where the psychological dimension of competition is so significant. He was given the nickname King James before he had played a professional game. Sports Illustrated put him on its cover when he was still in high school. The expectations attached to him before he arrived were so enormous that the normal psychological response would have been either collapse under the weight or rebellion against the framing. He did neither. He accepted the framing with a kind of calm that looked from the outside like confidence, but was in fact something more interesting than that. It was strategic acceptance. He understood that the narrative of expectation could work for him rather than against him if he managed his relationship to it carefully. He did not pretend not to be aware of it. He acknowledged it, then set about fulfilling it on his own terms. The terms being his performance, his preparation, his physical investment, his basketball intelligence. Those were the things he could control. The narrative would follow from those things if the work was done correctly. And when the narrative turned against him, as it did spectacularly in 2010, he did not attempt to immediately recapture the favorable story. He let it sit. He did the work. He waited for the results to create a new narrative rather than trying to manage his way to one through words. There is a discipline in that. A lot of people who are very conscious of narrative become addicted to the management of it and lose sight of the work that narrative should be reflecting. He never fell into that trap. The work always came first. The story was always downstream of the work. The 10th principle, and in some ways the one that ties all the others together, is what might be called the construction of a personal standard that has nothing to do with external measurement. LeBron James is not competing against other players. He is competing against a version of himself that exists in his own mind, a standard that he has been building and refining since childhood. Other players are data points in that competition. They tell him where he stands relative to the field. But the real competition, the one that drives the daily work, the film study, the physical investment, the preparation, is internal. It is between who he is today and who he believes he is capable of being. This is not a cliche. It is a specific cognitive architecture that produces specific behaviors. Because when your primary competitor is an internal standard rather than an external opponent, you do not stop competing when you have beaten the external field. You continue competing because the internal standard continues to rise. Michael Jordan was an external reference point for a while. He surpassed Jordan's scoring record. Kobe Bryant was an external reference point. He surpassed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's point total on national television and seemed in that moment not triumphant, but moved, genuinely moved, in a way that suggested the accomplishment mattered to him for reasons that went beyond the number. It mattered because the internal standard he had been measuring himself against since he was a teenager said that this was what was possible. And the record was confirmation that he had been right about what was possible, that the standard he set for himself had been worth setting. This internal orientation has a practical consequence that is worth noting. It makes him unusually difficult to destabilize. When your motivation is external, when it is about beating a specific opponent or proving yourself to a specific group of people, it is vulnerable to disruption. If the opponent is injured, if the audience stops caring, if the critics find something else to critique, the motivational engine loses fuel. When the motivation is internal, none of that applies. The engine runs on its own logic. The critics can say whatever they want. The comparisons can shift and evolve. The landscape of the league can change entirely. None of it changes the internal standard. None of it changes the daily work. None of it changes the investment in the body, the preparation, the film, the collective, because those things are not responses to the external environment. They're expressions of the internal architecture. There is something worth pausing on about the way he has functioned as a leader, because it differs in important ways from the dominant models of leadership that get celebrated in sports. The dominant model, the one that Jordan exemplified and that has been romanticized extensively in sports culture, is the demanding authoritarian. The leader who holds everyone to an impossibly high standard, who calls out failure publicly, who creates fear as a motivational tool, who uses the threat of judgment and exclusion to extract maximum performance from those around him. This model works. It has produced championships, and it has produced great performances from the people who exist within it. But it comes at significant cost to the people who experience it, and sometimes to the leader who employs it. LeBron James operates according to a different model. His leadership is primarily constructive rather than punitive. He invests in the success of those around him rather than threatening them with failure. He studies his teammates the way he studies opponents, to understand what they are capable of, where their best version lives, and how to create conditions in which that best version can appear. This does not mean he is not demanding. People who have played with him describe high standards and clear expectations. But the delivery mechanism is different. The investment comes before the demand. The understanding precedes the requirement. He builds trust first and then leverages it. And because people who feel genuinely seen and invested in tend to give more than people who are operating out of fear, his teams tend to give him what he needs when he needs it. There is a broader philosophy here about the relationship between leadership and performance extraction. Fear produces compliance. Genuine investment produces commitment. And commitment, particularly in high-pressure moments when compliance is insufficient, is what separates teams that win from teams that almost win. His championship teams have, almost without exception, been teams where the role players exceeded their historical performance levels. That is not coincidence. That is the product of a leadership approach that created the conditions for commitment rather than mere compliance. There's a pattern worth naming explicitly because it runs through every one of these principles and connects them. LeBron James has spent his entire career building systems. Not just competitive systems, not just basketball systems, but systems for every aspect of his professional and personal life. Financial systems, physical maintenance systems, preparation systems, team building systems, narrative management systems, business systems, legacy building systems. He is, in the deepest sense, a systems thinker. And what distinguishes him from other elite competitors who are also intelligent is the breadth of the systems he has built and the consistency with which he maintains them over time. Most elite athletes build one system very well. The competition system, the training and performance system. LeBron James has built that system and then surrounded it with a dozen others, each of which supports and reinforces the central one. The physical maintenance system makes the competition system possible for longer. The financial system removes the psychological pressure of financial insecurity that can erode competitive focus. The team-building system ensures that the competition system operates in an environment with maximized resources. The narrative management system protects the mental space required for the competition system to function without interference. These systems interlock. They are not separate domains of activity. They are components of a single integrated architecture designed to sustain elite performance across the longest possible timeline. There is a word for this kind of thinking in the business world. It is called compounding. The idea that investments made today produce returns not just immediately but in the future, and that those future returns then produce further returns, and that over time, the cumulative effect of disciplined investment dwarfs any single large gain. LeBron James has applied the logic of compounding to his career in a way that almost no other athlete in modern history has done as consciously or as successfully. The investment in the body compounds. The investment in basketball knowledge compounds. The investment in business and financial infrastructure compounds. The investment in relationships compounds. The investment in the education of the children at his school in Akron, yes, that compounds too, in ways that matter to him, even if they are not legible as athletic achievements. The question of where this kind of thinking comes from is worth spending a moment on. Because it does not come from a vacuum. It does not come from nowhere. The child who missed 80 days of school in a single year because there was no stable home to return to at night, that child learned something that more privileged childhoods often do not teach. He learned that stability is not given, it is built. He learned that systems do not maintain themselves. They require constant attention and investment. He learned that the absence of a system is not neutrality. It is vulnerability. And he decided at a very young age that he would not be vulnerable to things he could control. He would build the systems, he would maintain them, he would protect them, he would expand them. Not because someone told him to, but because the alternative was the instability of his earliest years, and he had already decided that he was never going back there. This is, in a sense, the emotional root of everything. The technical brilliance, the basketball intelligence, the physical investment, the business acumen, all of it grows from this root. From the decision made by a child in Akron, Ohio, that the world was a place in which things could be built if you were willing to do the work of building them. That instability was not inevitable, that the future could be shaped rather than merely suffered, that talent was a starting point, not a destination, and that the distance between starting point and destination was filled entirely with work. It is worth examining the 2003 NBA draft night as a moment that could have gone differently. LeBron James was the obvious first pick. Everyone knew it. There was no drama about the selection itself, but there was an enormous amount of drama about the environment into which he was being selected. The Cleveland Cavaliers were not a good team. They were not a team with a clear path to contention in the short term. They were a franchise that had been struggling, a market that was not considered glamorous, a situation that many would have viewed as a challenging starting point for a player who was supposed to be the next great thing in basketball. And LeBron James went there and did not treat it as a hardship. He treated it as a construction site. He was going to build something here. The materials available were limited, but he was going to build anyway. What he built in Cleveland over the next 7 years was not a dynasty. It was something more interesting than a dynasty. It was the demonstration of what one extraordinary player, operating with limited resources but maximum intelligence and effort, could achieve. He took a team with almost no other legitimate stars to within one win of the finals by his third season. He carried that team further than anyone watching it from the outside believed was possible. He became, in the process, one of the most studied players in the history of the game. Because the question of how one person could compensate so completely for the deficiencies around him while playing at an individual level that was also historically unprecedented was genuinely fascinating to watch. What he built in Cleveland over the next 7 years was not a dynasty. It was something more interesting than a dynasty. It was the demonstration of what one extraordinary player, operating with limited resources but maximum intelligence and effort, could achieve. He took a team with almost no other legitimate stars to within one win of the finals by his third season. He carried that team further than anyone watching it from the outside believed was possible. He became, in the process, one of the most studied players in the history of the game, because the question of how one person could compensate so completely for the deficiencies around him while playing at an individual level that was also historically unprecedented was genuinely fascinating to watch. One specific element of those early Cleveland years that tends to get overlooked in retrospect is the speed with which he developed as a tactical thinker. In his first couple of seasons, he was remarkable primarily as an athlete, as a physical presence whose combination of size, speed, and strength created problems that defenders had no established template for addressing. But within 3 seasons, something had shifted. The tactical dimension, always present, had caught up to and in some ways overtaken the physical dimension as his primary competitive advantage. He was using the threat of his athleticism to create the space and mismatches that his passing and decision-making could then exploit, rather than relying on athleticism alone to produce results. This is a developmental trajectory that should have taken longer. Most players do not develop at the cognitive level as quickly as their bodies develop at the physical level. In him, the two accelerated simultaneously, which meant that he was operating with rare cognitive sophistication at an age when most players are still primarily athletic competitors. His coaches in those early years were aware of this and found it genuinely unusual to navigate. How do you coach someone who often knows more about what the game requires in a specific moment than you do? The answer, for the better coaches in his life, was to stop trying to coach the knowledge and instead focus on providing structures that allowed his knowledge to operate effectively. This was a lesson in ego management for coaches, and the ones who learned it got more from him than the ones who did not. And when he left for Miami in 2010, the decision was not, as critics framed it, a betrayal of the hard work of the previous 7 years. It was the application of a lesson learned from those 7 years. The lesson was that individual excellence, no matter how extraordinary, has limits when the surrounding system is inadequate. He had given Cleveland everything he had, and it was not enough. Not because he did not try hard enough, because the resources were insufficient. The Miami move was not a retreat from hard work. It was a pivot to a smarter structural strategy. It was the athlete becoming the architect, understanding that the building he was trying to construct required different materials than were available in his current location. The years in Miami are worth examining for what they reveal about his learning process. In his first season, the Heat fell short in the finals in the way already discussed. But watch what he was doing in that season. He was learning not just about basketball, though that too. He was learning about what it means to be part of a genuine collective of elite performers rather than the singular load-bearing structure of a lesser team. He was learning how to share responsibility in a way he had not had to before, how to win without always being the one winning it, how to trust at the highest level of competition. These are skills that do not come naturally to players who have spent their entire careers as the primary resource. They have to be built. He built them. And in the following season, they produced a championship. There is something worth examining carefully in the way LeBron James thinks about time during a game. Most players experience the game at a single speed. They are in the moment, responding to what is in front of them, executing what they have practiced, reacting to the flow of the action. LeBron James has always seemed to experience the game at 2 speeds simultaneously. The first speed is the normal speed of the action, the one everyone sees. The second speed is slower and more panoramic, a kind of elevated perspective from which he is watching the patterns of the game unfold across longer intervals than the immediate possession. He is tracking the tendencies of defenders across a quarter, not just a possession. He is noticing the fatigue levels of opposing players across the second half, not just the current moment. He is running probability calculations on what the opposing coach will do in a specific situation, informed by everything he has observed across the entire game, not just the last few minutes. This dual-speed processing is a documented feature of high-level sporting intelligence, and it is one of the reasons his assist numbers have been elite, even in seasons when his scoring was the primary story. He sees the pass before the situation that will create it has fully materialized. He is operating in some meaningful sense slightly ahead of the game he is playing, which means that when the moment arrives, his response is never quite a reaction. It is an execution. This relates to something his coaches in Cleveland first noticed and that has been commented on repeatedly since. He tends to play the fourth quarter of close games better than any other quarter, not just as well, better. Most players experience performance degradation under the accumulating pressure of a tight game in the final period. Fatigue is a factor, But so is the psychological weight of the stakes, which increases with every minute. The cortisol levels, the awareness of what is being competed for, the crowd, the scoreboard, all of these inputs tend to degrade the precision of thought and execution in most people. In LeBron James, the opposite appears to happen. The pressure seems to clarify his thinking rather than cloud it. It seems to narrow his focus to exactly the variables that matter and eliminate everything peripheral. He has described in interviews a sensation of the game slowing down in high-pressure moments, of things becoming simpler rather than more complicated. This is a recognizable psychological state, one that performance researchers have studied extensively, and it is not guaranteed by talent or effort. It is a specific trained capacity, the product of years of deliberately putting himself into high-pressure situations, in practice, in film study, in competition, and building the mental architecture that can hold those situations without fragmenting. The practice habits of elite performers tend to be, on close examination, different in a specific way from the habits of merely good performers. The difference is not primarily about duration, though duration matters. The difference is about the deliberateness of the discomfort. Great performers do not practice what they are already good at least not primarily. They practice the things they cannot yet do well. They manufacture conditions that are more difficult than competition, so that competition, when it arrives, feels comparatively manageable. LeBron James has been described by his shooting coaches over the years as an almost unusually willing subject in this regard. He is not a natural shooter by the standards of the elite shooting specialists in the league. He has worked on his jumper repeatedly throughout his career, at different points with different coaches, addressing different mechanical elements, adjusting his release, adjusting his footwork, adjusting his decision-making about when to take the shot and when to decline it. Each of these adjustments was uncomfortable. Each of them required him to be temporarily worse at something before he became better at it. He accepted that discomfort without resistance. The willingness to be temporarily worse in the service of being eventually better is a specific kind of psychological tolerance that many talented people lack. They are too attached to the current version of their performance to risk the temporary degradation that improvement requires. He has never had that attachment. Improvement has always mattered more than the preservation of what currently exists. The return to Cleveland in 2014 is one of the most interesting decisions in the history of professional sports, and it is interesting precisely because it should not have happened by the logic of pure athletic ambition. Golden State was getting better. The rest of the East was not particularly threatening. Cleveland had improved, but was still not obviously the best vehicle for his ambitions, and yet he went back. His letter explaining the decision, written with Lee Jenkins of Sports Illustrated, was explicit about the reasoning. It was about home. It was about Akron. It was about the people who had been with him from the beginning. It was about the story he was building and the specific chapter that needed to be written. And then, 2 years later, he wrote it. The 3-1 comeback, the block, the championship, the tears. The story was real. It had been built over years of decisions that the short-term logic of pure athletic achievement would not have produced, but that the longer logic of legacy construction required. There's a moment from the aftermath of the 2016 championship that encapsulates something essential about how his mind works. He was asked about the comeback, about coming back from 3 games to 1, about what that meant, and his answer was not the expected one. He did not talk about heart. He did not talk about refusing to quit. He talked about the adjustments. He talked about specific things the team had discussed between games, specific tactical modifications, specific matchup changes, specific plays they had identified in film that they had not been executing. He talked about it the way an engineer talks about solving a problem. Here was the problem. Here were the constraints. Here were the adjustments we made. Here was the result. Not because he is cold or emotionally flat. Clearly he is not. The tears at the end of that game told you everything about the emotional reality of what he was experiencing. But his framework for understanding how victories happen is analytical, even when his experience of them is deeply emotional. He keeps the two things separate because he needs both of them. The emotion tells him why it matters. The analysis tells him how to make it happen. The Los Angeles chapter of his career, which began in 2018, offered yet another opportunity to observe the systems at work. He was 33 years old when he signed with the Lakers, an age at which most players from previous generations would have been finishing their careers or already retired. He was joining a franchise that, whatever its historical prestige, was not at that moment a contending team. He was entering the most talent-rich conference in the league, where multiple teams were genuine championship contenders, and in his second season in Los Angeles, he won the championship, leading a team through an unprecedented bubble environment in the middle of a global pandemic, performing at a level that would have been the career peak of most players, and doing so at age 35. How? The physical investment, the preparation, the film study, the collective orientation, the internal standard, all of it still running, still producing, still compounding, 35 years old and still the best player on a championship team. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen through talent alone. That is the product of systems maintained across 2 decades with the discipline and consistency that most people cannot sustain even for 2 years. The business dimension of his career deserves its own examination, because it is not separate from the athletic story. It is continuous with it. He formed Spring Hill Entertainment. He became a partner in Beats by Dre before its acquisition by Apple. He acquired a stake in Liverpool Football Club. He opened I Promise School in Akron, a public school for at-risk children, the children most similar to the one he had been, providing them with not just education, but housing support, food security, family counseling, and a pathway to college. He built a media company. He produced films and television series. He pursued and eventually achieved the status of NBA team owner, a goal he stated publicly and pursued methodically. None of this is incidental. None of it is the typical athlete's diversification strategy, pursued because an agent suggested it. Each of these moves is part of a coherent strategy built on the same principles as the athletic career. Identify the leverage point. Build the system. Invest in the long term. Refuse to be dependent on any single institution. Build equity rather than income. The difference between being paid and owning something is the difference between being a resource and being an owner of resources. He understood that distinction early and spent his career converting the first into the second wherever he could. None of this is incidental. None of it is the typical athlete's diversification strategy pursued because an agent suggested it. Each of these moves is part of a coherent strategy built on the same principles as the athletic career. Identify the leverage point. Build the system. Invest in the long term. Refuse to be dependent on any single institution. Build equity rather than income. The difference between being paid and owning something is the difference between being a resource and being an owner of resources. He understood that distinction early and spent his career converting the first into the second wherever he could. To understand how unusual this thinking was, it helps to understand the historical context of the athlete-institution relationship in American professional sports. For most of the 20th century, athletes were employees in the most constrained sense. They were under contract to teams that held enormous power over their movement, their earning potential, and their public image. Even the best athletes, even the transcendent ones, operated within a framework that they did not design and could not fundamentally alter. The wealth generated by their performance flowed primarily to the owners of teams and the executives of leagues and the corporations that purchased advertising. The athletes received salaries, sometimes very large ones, but salaries without equity, without ownership, without a stake in the larger value creation they were central to producing. LeBron James grew up watching what happened to athletes at the end of this arrangement. He grew up in an era when former NBA players who had made millions were struggling financially because salary without equity does not compound. A dollar earned and spent is gone. A dollar invested in an ownership stake continues to produce. He decided before he was old enough to fully execute on the decision that he would not participate in the historical arrangement on its historical terms. He would participate, yes, he would play in the league, he would honor his contracts, he would perform at the highest possible level within the structure that existed. But simultaneously, he would build a parallel structure outside of it, one that he owned, one whose returns were his rather than belonging to institutions he did not control. Maverick Carter, his childhood friend and longtime business partner, has spoken in interviews about conversations they had when both were still teenagers. Conversations about the business model of being LeBron James that went far beyond what most 17-year-olds discuss. They were talking about branding, about equity, about the difference between endorsement income and ownership. They were building a framework in their minds that they would spend the next 2 decades executing. This is the same quality that produced the basketball intelligence, applied to a different domain. The tendency to study the system, understand its logic, identify the leverage points, and then operate at those leverage points rather than anywhere else. The school in Akron is perhaps the most revealing of all of these moves, because it is the one that is hardest to explain purely in strategic terms. It is, in the most literal sense, a giving back to the community that made him, an investment in children who have the same starting circumstances he had, but who will now have resources and structures around them that he did not have. The decision to build that school is the decision of someone who has never stopped being the kid from Akron, no matter how large the career has grown. It is the decision of someone who understands that what he built matters partly because of what it enables him to do for others. Legacy is not just about what your career looks like from the outside, it is about what you build that outlasts you. The school will outlast the playing career. That was the point. There's a pattern that emerges when you look across all of these years and all of these decisions and all of these systems. The pattern is this. LeBron James has always been willing to make the decision that requires longer time horizons than the people around him were using. When he left Cleveland in 2010, most of the people criticizing him were using a short time horizon. What does this do to your reputation right now? And the answer was clearly negative. He was using a longer one. What does this do to my ability to win championships across the full arc of my career? And the answer was clearly positive. When he returned to Cleveland in 2014, most of the analysis was short-term. This is a worse team than the Heat. He was thinking about the chapter of the story that needed to be written, a longer horizon. When he invested millions per year in his physical maintenance, the short-term analysis was questionable. Surely that money could be deployed more efficiently elsewhere. The long-term analysis was obviously correct. The body held together when it should have declined. The championship at 35. The scoring record at 38. The returns on that investment were enormous. They just required time to materialize. This is perhaps the rarest thing about him, and the thing most worth studying for anyone who cares about the mechanics of sustained excellence. Not the talent, not even the work ethic, though that is extraordinary. The willingness to think in time horizons that are longer than the culture around him uses. The culture of professional sports is, by its nature, short-term. The season matters. The game matters. The moment matters. He participates fully in that culture during the moments when it operates. He is not a dreamer who is detached from the present. He is as present, as competitive, as ferocious in individual moments as any player who has ever played the game. But beneath the present moment ferocity, there is always a longer calculation running. Always a consideration of where this moment fits in the larger arc. Always an assessment of what the decision made today will mean, not next week, but next year and the year after that. That dual processing, simultaneously fully present in the immediate competitive moment and simultaneously calculating the longer arc of what is being built, is the deepest structural feature of how he operates. It is what allows him to be as emotionally engaged as he clearly is while also being as analytically precise. The emotion belongs to the present. The analysis belongs to the future. He holds both simultaneously and lets each do its work without interfering with the other. There is a version of the LeBron James story that focuses on the rings, on the championships, on the comparison to Jordan and the debate about the greatest of all time. That version is fine. It is interesting in its own right, but it is not the most interesting version. The most interesting version is the one we have been examining here. The version that asks not just what he achieved, but how. What cognitive and behavioral architecture produced this career? What habits of mind? What disciplines? What early formations? What philosophical commitments made this specific trajectory possible? Because the answer to that question is more useful and more transferable than the championship count. The championship count is his alone. Nobody else will win his championships. Nobody else will have his specific physical gifts or his specific opportunities or his specific era. But the principles, the body as infrastructure, the preparation and film study as genuine epistemic tools, the positional and identity fluidity, the willingness to be wrong in service of being right, the collective orientation, the legacy consciousness, the capacity for reinvention without loss of identity, the sophisticated version of resilience, the narrative awareness, the internal standard as primary competition, all of these are principles that exist independent of basketball. They are principles about how a mind can be organized to produce sustained excellence across long-time horizons in the face of enormous external pressure. And every single one of them was present in some form in the child from Akron who was moving from address to address, missing school, sleeping in whatever bed was available, watching the adults around him struggle and trying to understand how the world worked. He did not learn these principles from a book or a coach or a mentor, though mentors helped. He inferred them from the raw material of his own experience, from the understanding, acquired early and reinforced repeatedly, that the world does not guarantee anything, and that the only way to build something durable is to build it yourself, on a foundation of your own construction, maintained by your own discipline, protected by your own investment. The closing image of this analysis does not belong in a gymnasium. It belongs in Akron, Ohio, at the I Promise School, in a classroom where children who were born into circumstances not unlike his are being given tools and structures and resources that he did not have. That is where the arc of this career ultimately points. Not to the scoring record, though that is extraordinary, not to the championships, though they are remarkable, but to the school, to the decision to take everything that was built, all of the systems, all of the compounding returns on decades of investment, and to direct some of it toward children who are standing at the same starting point he stood at, and to give them a better infrastructure than the one he had to build entirely from scratch. Before we arrive at the final thought, it is worth dwelling one more time on the way that adversity has functioned in this story. Because the narrative of LeBron James is frequently told as though the path was always clear, as though the outcome was always obvious, as though the trajectory was predetermined by the talent. It was not. There were multiple moments in this career when a different response to adversity would have produced an entirely different outcome. The 2011 finals performance, played out on the largest possible stage, in front of an audience that was already skeptical and eager for confirmation of its doubts, could have been the moment that defined him differently. It could have been the moment from which he never fully recovered, not because the failure itself was insurmountable, but because the psychological response to it could have been corrosive. The response instead was to treat it as information, to sit with the discomfort without resolving it prematurely by manufacturing excuses, to identify the specific internal failure that produced the external one, and then to go to work on that internal failure with the same methodical discipline that he brought to every other aspect of his preparation. This is, in the vocabulary of sports psychology, the difference between a performance orientation and a mastery orientation. A performance orientation is focused on demonstrating competence to external audiences. A mastery orientation is focused on actually developing competence, regardless of what the external audience sees or thinks. In a performance orientation, failure is a threat to identity. In a mastery orientation, failure is a source of information. He has always, even when it has not been obvious from the outside, operated with a mastery orientation at the core. The proof of that is in the trajectory. If you plot his career not as a series of outcomes, but as a series of capability developments, the picture that emerges is of a player who was continuously learning, continuously improving, continuously adding dimensions to his game and his preparation and his understanding. Not in every single year, the curve was not perfectly smooth. But across the arc, the direction was always the same: forward, deeper, wiser, more complete. This is what a mastery orientation produces over time, not just results, but growth. And growth, compounded across 2 decades, produces something that mere performance, no matter how spectacular in isolated moments, cannot match. There is a final thing worth noting about the nature of his competitive drive, one that is easy to miss because it is so unusual. Most elite competitors, when asked what motivates them, describe something that is essentially about fear. Fear of losing, fear of being seen as less than the best, fear of the moment when someone else is better. This fear is powerful. It has produced great performances, but it is also fundamentally reactive, oriented toward avoiding a negative outcome rather than pursuing a positive one. LeBron James, at least in the way he discusses his motivation, describes something more constructive than fear. He describes a vision, a picture of what is possible, a standard that he is trying to reach rather than a failure he is trying to avoid. The athletic expression of his internal architecture has always been oriented forward, toward the construction of something, rather than backward, toward the protection of something already built. That is what the story of LeBron James ultimately tells us. Not that greatness is accessible to everyone, because it is not, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Not that hard work guarantees anything, because it does not, and the world is full of people who work hard and do not achieve what he has achieved. But that the organization of effort matters enormously, that the systems built around talent determine how far that talent can travel, that the time horizons used in decision-making shape outcomes in ways that compound over decades. That resilience, properly understood, is not about endurance, but about the intelligent extraction of information from failure. That the body is infrastructure and should be treated as such. That the collective is not a constraint on individual excellence, but the environment within which individual excellence becomes most fully possible. That leadership built on investment produces more than leadership built on fear. That a mastery orientation, maintained across decades, produces a kind of growth that a performance orientation cannot replicate. And that the child formed by instability and loss, and the repeated experience of things being taken away, can, if the response to that formation is the right one, become the most durable architect of sustained excellence in the history of the game they chose to build their life around. He said it before you were ready to believe him. He was not the next Michael Jordan. He was the first LeBron James. And now you know what that means, not just as a basketball achievement, as a blueprint, as a demonstration that the organization of a life, with the same care and intelligence that most people reserve only for the specific craft they practice, produces something different in kind from what talent alone can generate. He organized his life. He built systems for every dimension of it. He invested in time horizons longer than the culture around him used. He extracted information from failure rather than shame. He treated every person around him as a resource to be understood and elevated. He never stopped learning. He never stopped building. And the result is a career that will be studied by serious students of sustained excellence long after the championships and the records have been absorbed into history.